Imagine a girl, just 13 years old, trapped in a battle between life and death. She's in the throes of childbirth, in a cold, dark room, with only flickering candlelight for company. Her cries echo through the stone walls. But the real battle isn't just for her life, it's for the future of England itself. This is the untold story of Margaret of Beaufort, the mother who birthed the King, and in doing so, changed the course of history forever. What price did she pay to see her son crowned? And what does it mean to fight for a throne when everything, your body, your soul, your very family, is on the line? In the dead of night, a scream echoed through the stone halls of Bleo Castle. It was sharp, desperate, like a cry that could tear the very walls apart. The howling wind outside fought against the flickering light of candles inside the chamber, where 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort lay. The sheets beneath her were stained with blood, and her young body was racked with pain no child should endure. The midwives gathered around her, their voices muffled by the urgency and their prayers murmuring in Latin as their eyes darted nervously from Margaret's exhausted face to the swollen belly that had been a burden far too soon. Outside, snow was falling thick and heavy across Bedfordshire's frozen ground. Inside, the air was thick with dread. Margaret's body, still that of a child, was attempting something that had claimed the lives of many women far older than her. The birth was proving to be an impossible trial. Her body wasn't ready. She was too young, her hips too narrow, and the baby far too large. The room was dim, filled with the scent of burnt herbs and the quiet whisper of frightened women. They had seen death before, but tonight the danger was all too real. What none of the attendants could have known was the child Margaret carried was the future King of England, the one who would ultimately wear the crown as Henry VIII. But as the hours stretched on in agony, no one could see that far. All they knew was the fear that Margaret might not survive the night. The situation was dire. The midwives prayed, though they knew that the only true intervention would come from forces beyond their control. Margaret's sweat-drenched hair clung to her face, her small hands gripping the sheets as another contraction tore through her fragile frame. Her breath came in gasps, each one more labored than the last. Those gathered around her exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. The suffering of this child, giving birth to a future king, was the cruel irony no one dared speak aloud. But everyone knew it. In a world ruled by blood and politics, her pain might birth not just a king, but the end of a bloody conflict that was yet to begin. With each passing minute, the midwives grew increasingly alarmed. Margaret was no ordinary girl. She was of royal blood, descended from the powerful John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. His lineage had long been intertwined with the history of England. Her marriage, arranged at such a tender age, had been nothing more than a political necessity, binding her family to a royal line. Her future, like her body, had already been predetermined by others. But here, in this chamber, with the winds of war waiting to blow through the kingdom, Margaret's fate was still hers to claim. The very life of her child would shape the future of a nation. Little did she know, the agonizing birth she now endured would forge a new dynasty, a dynasty that would redefine England's history for generations to come. As the night wore on, Margaret's body weakened, her young frame stretched beyond its limits. The midwives were resigned to the fact that they might lose both mother and child. But then, through the haze of blood and pain, Margaret felt something stir within her. The baby moved, the cry of life piercing through the walls, silencing the dreadful night. A brief pause filled the room. A new life had entered the world, a life that would forever change the course of history. Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, was born. But for Margaret, the battle was far from over. She had endured the birth, but her body had paid a heavy price. The toll it had taken on her, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, was immeasurable. Her life, once full of innocence and dreams of a future dictated by political ties, had now been forever altered. The physical agony she had suffered was matched only by the emotional scars that would linger for the rest of her life. As dawn's first light crept into the chamber, Margaret lay broken, her body shattered by the trauma of the birth. Yet amidst the agony, there was a strange sense of triumph. Her son had been born, though at great cost. But the question remained, would Margaret herself survive this ordeal? Lady Margaret Beaufort's blood was not ordinary. It coursed through her veins with the legacy of kings and dynasties. This heritage, while a privilege would soon become a heavy chain around her neck. Her father, John Boet, the first Duke of Somerset, was of the Lancastrian line, descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the fourth son of Edward III. It was this royal connection that placed Margaret squarely in the middle of the blood-soaked conflicts that would tear England apart. Margaret's royal bloodline made her a valuable commodity in a country where power was not inherited by merit but by blood and birthright. The Wars of the Roses had already begun to stir, with the White Rose of York pitted against the Red Rose of Lancaster, and her existence would serve as the pivot on which countless political ambitions turned. In 1457, the Lancastrian claim to the throne was weakening. The reigning King Henry VI was widely seen as weak and unstable, leaving a volatile vacuum that others eagerly sought to fill. And yet at 13, Margaret was still a child. Unaware of the magnitude of the role she would one day play in the unfolding saga of her house. Her marriage, arranged before her birth, was not one of love, but of necessity. This was the currency of the aristocracy. From a tender age, Margaret was expected to understand that her value lay not in her thoughts or desires, but in her bloodline. Her marriage to Edmund Tudor at the age of 12 was a strategic alliance meant to solidify the Tudor claim to the throne, ensuring that the Tudor line could hold power. Edmund, a man in his 20s, was a seasoned military figure, a loyal servant to the Lancastrian cause. And Margaret was quite literally a pawn in the hands of those who would seek to control the future of England. What was it like for a 12-year-old to be thrust into the throes of such a political alliance? Margaret's mind, still that of a child's, could not possibly have understood the complex webs being woven around her. Her father, the Duke of Somerset, had already died in mysterious circumstances, and her mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Beauchamp, was a woman who knew all too well the price of survival. She guided her daughter through the darkened world of politics, teaching her that her marriage would not be a romantic union, but rather a maneuver in the brutal Game of Thrones. But Margaret's bloodline was not just an asset, was also a curse. Her descent from John of Gaunt meant that her family had enemies both within and outside of the royal court. Her blood tied her to the crown, but it also marked her as a target in a world where loyalty was as shifting as the tides. The political landscape of 15th century England was a labyrinth of betrayal and shifting alliances, where every marriage was a tool and every birth a strategic move. Her early years were marked by the loss of her father, whose death under mysterious circumstances, whether by poison or the weight of failure, left her with a sense of unease. The whispers of poison that followed his death, whether founded or not, painted the world of the nobility as a place where nothing could be trusted, not even 1A's own family. Margaret's father, John Boet, had spent his life in the service of England, fighting in the 100 Years' War, but in the end it was not the French who defeated him, but his own body, and perhaps the crushing weight of his own disgrace. The death of her father in 1444, when Margaret was just a year old, left her with a legacy she did not fully understand, but would one day be forced to confront. She would grow up with the knowledge that she was not just a daughter of nobility, but a link in a chain of political maneuvering. Margaret's mother, the Dowager Duchess, was a woman of great cunning and understanding. She knew that survival in this brutal world required more than just strength. It required the ability to adapt, to seize opportunities, and to act without hesitation when the time came. She steered Margaret through a world that demanded loyalty, but offered none in return. As Margaret grew, her position in the royal family became ever more precarious. She was a child of the House of Lancaster, but that house was fracturing. Her bloodline was both a weapon and a liability. The Yorkists, with their claim to the throne through the son of Edward III's second son, were rising in power, and the fate of her family would soon depend on which side she chose. The shifting alliances, betrayals, and ambitions of those around her would soon force her to make decisions that would alter the course of history. Margaret's blood, a legacy of royal power, was both her birthright and her burden. She was marked from the moment of her birth as a piece to be moved in the deadly Game of Thrones, and she would learn early on that royal blood was both a blessing and a curse. But in a world where survival meant constant adaptation, Margaret would become far more than just a pawn. She would become a queen maker, a mother of kings, and a strategist whose influence would be felt long after the Wars of the Roses had ended. The death of John Bowet, the Duke of Somerset, cast a long, dark shadow over his daughter Margaret's early life. Margaret had never known her father as a man of health and vitality, only as a figure ravaged by defeat and disappointment. He was a man whose legacy was not one of triumph, but one of sorrow and ruin. To Margaret, his death was not a loss she could properly grieve. It was a turning point in her life, one that would set the stage for her eventual struggle for survival in a world that did not forgive weakness. John Bowet had been a soldier, a commander of English forces during the latter part of the 100 Years' War. Yet his return from France in 1444 did not signal victory, but rather the culmination of a series of catastrophic military failures. The territory lost in France, once claimed by Henry V, had slipped away under his watch. For John, each loss was a personal blow, a crushing defeat to his honor and pride. The very land he had once fought to protect now seemed to reject him, his efforts seen as futile. It wasn't just the English defeat on the battlefield that wore him down, it was the bitter, corrosive shame of failure. When he returned to England, John was a man broken in body and spirit. His court colleagues remarked upon his hollow eyes and trembling hands, his silence, his inability to eat or find solace in conversation. The weight of his failures seemed to have crushed his will to live, and he spent long hours staring into nothingness. Haunted by his inability to live up to the legacy of his ancestors, Margaret, still a small child at the time, could not understand the depths of his despair. But as she grew, she would come to understand that the very bloodline that had once been a source of pride could also be the cause of unbearable pressure. The rumors surrounding his death were as dark as the man's final days. The official cause was fever, a common affliction that claimed many lives in an age without modern medicine. But those who had been close to John whispered of a different cause. Some said he had been poisoned. Others speculated that he had taken his own life in a desperate attempt to escape the humiliation of failure. The whispers of poison were not uncommon in the courts of the time, where every unexpected death among the nobility was subject to scrutiny and suspicion. But whatever the cause, John Bowet's death left a gaping hole in the life of his young daughter, a hole she would never truly be able to fill. For Margaret, the death of her father was more than a personal loss. It was the loss of her connection to the political world that had been her birthright. John Bowet had been a duke, a figure of importance in the English court. His death left his daughter exposed, a child of noble blood but without the security that her father's position had provided. Margaret's mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Beauchamp, understood that their world had changed, and she quickly adapted to ensure the survival of her family. She knew that her daughter's future, like her own, would be shaped not by affection or personal desire, but by the strategic alliances they could secure. The Duke's death also marked the beginning of Margaret's own journey into the harsh realities of court politics. At the time of his death, Margaret was still a toddler, too young to understand the intricacies of power, but by the time she came of age, she would see the true cost of the bloodline she had inherited, the never-ending cycle of betrayal, alliances, and power struggles that defined the English nobility. Margaret's early years were spent in the shadow of her father's death, trying to make sense of a world where life and death were determined not by personal merit or kindness, but by power. Her mother, a woman of unparalleled pragmatism, wasted no time in securing her daughter's future. She knew that survival in this world required more than just wealth or nobility, required the ability to use marriage as a weapon. By the time Margaret was 6, she was already betrothed to John de Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk, in a political arrangement that was meant to solidify an alliance between the powerful Bowet and de Pole families. The betrothal was not one born out of love, but rather of necessity. In the world Margaret inhabited, marriage was the currency of power, and she had been traded like a valuable possession in a game of political chess. Her mother, who had learned how to navigate the dangers of the court, ensured that Margaret's future would not be left to chance. But as always in the world of medieval politics, fate had other plans. The untimely death of John de Pole in 1450, under suspicious circumstances, left Margaret once again adrift in a sea of political instability. The tragedy of her early years, the loss of her father, and the betrayal of her betrothal set the tone for Margaret's life. It was a life where survival depended on the ability to adapt, to make difficult decisions, and to remain silent when necessary. The political world was not kind to those who were too loud or too weak. It was a world that demanded toughness and cunning, traits Margaret would come to develop in abundance. But it was also a world where loyalty was fleeting, and where the value of bloodlines was often measured not by the strength of the family name, but by the ability to maneuver through a web of alliances and enemies. As the years passed, Margaret would come to understand the depth of the game she had been born into. Her father's death, the mystery surrounding it, the subsequent fall of her family's fortunes taught her early on that power was fleeting, and that survival was the greatest victory. But the price of survival was steep. And for Margaret, that price would come in the form of her own personal sacrifice. A sacrifice that would shape not just her fate, but the fate of England itself. Margaret's childhood was a time of lost innocence. It was quickly replaced by the burdens of a royal bloodline and the expectations of political maneuvering. Born into a world where a child's life was shaped by the whims of power rather than the freedom of youth, Margaret's days were spent less in carefree play and more in preparation for a future dictated by others. At the tender age of 6, her fate was sealed by a betrothal that would forever alter the course of her life. She was promised to John de Pole, the son of the Duke of Suffolk, a marriage that represented not love, but a strategic alliance, one designed to secure the political future of the Beauet family. In the world of 15th-century English nobility, marriage was the most powerful weapon at one's disposal, and Margaret's own future was never her own to choose. It was her bloodline, her family's position, and her potential to strengthen alliances that made her a prize in the eyes of those who sought to use her for their own purposes. As a young child, Margaret could not have comprehended the full weight of this alliance, but she felt its shadows even then. Her childhood in Bleo Castle, with its vast gardens and echoing corridors, was soon overshadowed by the realization that her life was not her own. Her betrothal to de Pole was a union between two powerful families, one that appeared unbreakable on paper. The marriage would have strengthened the ties between the Beauet family and the influential Suffolk family, positioning Margaret as a key player in the shifting landscape of power in England. But the world of noble alliances was volatile, and Margaret would learn that even the most carefully constructed plans could crumble in the blink of an eye. In 1450, just as the marriage contract was being solidified, a tragic and brutal turn of events altered everything. John de Pole, the man she was promised to, was brutally murdered while crossing the English Channel. His death was the result of political conflict. The Suffolk family had angered many with their role in negotiating the marriage of Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou, as well as their dealings with France. His murder was a reflection of the dangers of being a player in the ever-shifting game of political alliances, where loyalty was a fleeting thing, and betrayal was often a matter of life and death. Margaret's betrothal to de Pole, once a promising link in her family's political future, now became nothing more than a broken contract, a reminder of the fragility of her position. At just 7 years old, Margaret found herself once again in a position where survival, it's not just happiness, became her primary concern. The loss of her betrothal marked the beginning of her understanding that her life would not be dictated by personal desires, but by the need to adapt to the shifting tides of politics and power. Her mother, the Dowager Duchess, Margaret Beauchamp, who had already navigated the complexities of royal survival, wasted no time in securing a new future for her daughter. In the ever-dangerous world of medieval nobility, a girl's value was directly tied to her family's ability to make alliances, and Margaret's future needed to be safeguarded no matter the cost. With the sudden death of de Pole, the Duchess was forced to turn her attention to another potential match for Margarita, match that would eventually lead her into the arms of Edmund. Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of King Henry VI, was not a man Margaret knew or understood. He was older, a seasoned military man, and a figure who would become deeply entwined in Margaret's political destiny. By the time Margaret was 12, she had been married off to him in an alliance that seemed to promise stability, but was instead a precursor to even greater personal turmoil. The union consummated immediately after their marriage. It was a stark reminder of the limited agency women had in the political game. Margaret, still in the throes of childhood, found herself thrust into the adult world of marriage and political alliances. a world she was far too young to comprehend fully. The wedding night for Margaret was more a battle for survival than a celebration of a union. She was a child, her body not yet fully developed, yet she was expected to carry the weight of the Tudor family's ambitions. The trauma of that first night would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. Her body, still growing and delicate, was forced to endure something it was not yet ready for, and the damage it caused would forever change her. The physical consequences of her marriage would mark her body permanently, a constant reminder of the personal sacrifices she was forced to make in the name of family and dynasty. But Margaret was not one to simply endure. She began to understand that power in this world was not just about royal bloodlines, but about adaptability, intelligence, and the ability to navigate the complex web of loyalties and betrayals that defined her world. As she struggled to recover from the trauma of her marriage, she also began to develop the resilience and political savvy that would later make her one of the most formidable figures in English history. Her early marriage to Edmund Tudor, though fraught with hardship, served as a catalyst for Margaret's growth. It was not a union of love, but a union of necessity, and it was in this cold, pragmatic world of political alliances that Margaret would learn how to survive and thrive. The child who had once played in the gardens of Blayo Castle was now a woman shaped by duty, sacrifice, and the unrelenting pressure of her family's expectations. Margaret's early betrothal and marriage were just the beginning of her journey. They set the stage for a life that would be filled with betrayal, political intrigue, and moments of unimaginable suffering. But through it all, Margaret would emerge stronger, more determined, more capable of navigating the treacherous waters of English court politics than anyone could have imagined. The death of John de Pole came as a cruel shock, not only to Margaret, but to the entire political landscape of 15th century England. His brutal murder was a reminder of the danger lurking in the shifting tides of court politics, where loyalties were fleeting and betrayal could come from the unlikeliest of sources. De Pole, who had once been Margaret's betrothed, was the son of the Duke of Suffolk, and his death marked the end of one chapter in Margaret's life and the beginning of another, marked by increasing instability and treachery. In the year 1450, while England's political world was already in turmoil due to the ongoing Wars of the Roses, De Pole's murder served as a dramatic reminder of how volatile things were in the corridors of power. His murder was not a random act of violence, but a politically charged event, a violent reflection of the growing tensions between the nobility and the crown. It was said that De Pole was dragged from his ship by pirates or political enemies as he sailed across the English Channel. Some reports suggested that he had been forced to kneel on the gunwale of his vessel, and one of his captors had beheaded him with a rusty sword, after several clumsy blows and execution, as brutal as it was inefficient. The details of De Pole's murder were a stark reflection of the merciless world Margaret inhabited, where betrayal could strike without warning, and the lives of noblemen were subject to the whims of power struggles far beyond their control. His death served as a violent lesson for Margaret, teaching her early on that loyalty was a luxury few could afford in the unforgiving world of the English court. In a realm where political ambition often trumped personal relationships, the murder of a betrothed was nothing more than a casualty of the ever-changing alliances among the elite. For Margaret, De Pole's death shattered the world she had known. At such a young age, she had been promised to him as part of a broader political alliance, and with his murder, her hopes of a stable future vanished. She was once again left exposed, her future uncertain. The betrothal had been her ticket to political security, but with De Pole's murder, the carefully constructed plans of her mother, the Dowager Duchess, crumbled. The world around Margaret was unraveling, and she was left to face the harsh realities of her position. The murder sent shockwaves through the English nobility, particularly the Suffolk family, whose power had been diminished by De Pole's death. It also had profound consequences for Margaret, who had already lost so much. In the absence of De Pole, who had been her intended future husband, her place in the world became even more precarious. Her mother, who had been tirelessly securing advantageous marriages for her daughter, now had to act quickly to protect their family's interests. Margaret's survival, it seemed, would rely on adaptability and a keen understanding of the political forces at play. Margaret was only a child, but her early experiences of loss and betrayal shaped her understanding of the world. Her father's mysterious death had already taught her that power was fragile, And now Deppel's murder added a harsh new lesson. Alliances were fickle, and loyalty was often fleeting. Margaret learned that the promises of security made through marriage were no more solid than the air around her, easily shattered by the smallest shift in the political wind. As the years passed, Margaret's understanding of these lessons deepened. The tragedy of Deppel's death, and the harsh realities it revealed, would stay with her for the rest of her life. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that survival in her world would require more than just noble blood. It would take political acumen, careful planning, and the ability to make hard choices in the face of an ever-changing and often hostile world. The murder of John Deppel was not just a personal loss for Margaret, it was a stark reminder that the path to power was fraught with danger. And in her world, no one was safe from the brutal forces of politics. The tragedy that befell Deppel would mark the beginning of a long series of challenges Margaret would face as she fought to carve out a future for herself and her family. Amidst the chaos of civil war and political betrayal, her early life, steeped in such loss and turmoil, would shape her into a woman of incredible resilience, capable of surviving in a world that sought to destroy her at every turn. At the tender age of 12, Margaret Bowert found herself once again at the mercy of the forces shaping her future, and this time it was through a marriage to Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of King Henry VI. While many young girls her age were still playing in the gardens or learning to read, Margaret was thrust into the world of political alliances and dynastic survival. The marriage, though brief and full of hardship, would mark a pivotal moment in Margaret's life, one that would solidify her position in the dangerous and ever-shifting political landscape of 15th century England. The union between Margaret and Edmund Tudor was not based on love or affection, it was based on necessity. Edmund was a man already seasoned by the brutal world of politics and warfare, a man whose loyalty to the Lancastrian cause was unquestioned, yet also a man whose fate was intertwined with that of the turbulent reign of Henry VI to Margaret. He was little more than a political alliance, a union forged not by choice but by duty, one more link in the chain of her family's survival. At the time of their marriage, Margaret's body was still that of a child. She had not yet fully developed, and her youthful innocence was still clinging to her. Yet there she was, married off to a man twice her age, expected to bear children and strengthen alliances that would secure her family's future. Edmund was already a man of military experience, a fighter for the Lancastrian cause, and it was expected that his marriage to Margaret would cement his political standing and provide a steady foundation for the next generation of the Tudor line. The reality of their union, however, was far less romantic than any noble girl could have imagined. Margaret's wedding night was a traumatic experience, and one that would have lasting consequences for her physical and emotional well-being. A marriage consummated immediately, as was the custom at the time, was not a delicate act of love, but a brutal requirement of survival. Margaret, still in the bloom of childhood, was thrust into a world of adult responsibilities for which her body was not yet prepared. The immediate consummation of their marriage marked the beginning of Margaret's suffering. Her body, still too young to handle the weight of childbirth, was forced to endure the demands of a union that would leave her physically scarred. It was a painful reality that few girls her age could comprehend, but for Margaret, it was the price of survival. As the years went by, the physical consequences of that first night became more apparent, and the damage to her body would remain with her for the rest of her life. Edmund Tudor, though politically important, was never truly a figure in Margaret's life that she could rely on for emotional support. He was, like many of the men in her world, a product of political ambition and survival. He was a man of action, not one for tenderness or affection. His presence in Margaret's life was marked by duty, not love, and his role in their marriage was a reflection of the harsh realities of the time. Despite the personal toll their marriage took on Margaret, it was a necessary step in the greater game of power. The Tudor family, though somewhat out of place in the noble hierarchy, had risen through the ranks thanks to their ties to Henry VI and their military exploits. The Tudors, though seen as upstarts by some, had earned a place in the court through loyalty and ambition. Edmund's marriage to Margaret was an alliance that solidified his political position and tied the Bowert family more tightly to the Lancastrian cause. In the months following their marriage, Margaret began to adapt to her new life, though not without difficulty. Her body, still developing, struggled to keep up with the demands of a world that expected her to be both a wife and a political player. The marriage was not just a union of bodies, but of fates. And Margaret quickly realized that her life was no longer hers to direct. She was not allowed the luxury of childhood or innocence. She was expected to play her part in the high-stakes game of English politics. But even as Margaret endured the physical strain of her marriage, she also began to understand the intricacies of political survival. She observed the court closely, learning the subtle art of diplomacy. Understanding the shifting alliances that marked the instability of the reign of Henry VI. The marriage to Edmund Tudor, though painful, was an education in survival. It taught her that the world of the nobility was one where emotions were secondary to power, and the survival of one's family often came at the cost of one's own well-being. Margaret began to understand that her survival would depend not just on her ability to adapt, but on her ability to learn from the mistakes and successes of those around her. Her marriage to Edmund Tudor, though fraught with personal difficulty, was also the beginning of her education in the ways of the court. It was a lesson in power, in survival, and in the cold, calculating nature of political life. Her suffering did not break her, it made her stronger. Through the pain and the trauma, Margaret began to forge a path for herself that was independent of the men who controlled her life. Though her body had been marred by the brutal realities of medieval marriage, her mind began to sharpen, and her political instincts grew stronger. Margaret, once a child lost in the gardens of Bleau Castle, was now a woman forged by the fire of survival. Margaret's young life, already marked by the crushing weight of political alliances, was further shaken by the sudden and unexpected death of her husband, Edmund Tudor. The news came not in a letter, nor through a diplomat, but through a messenger who arrived at Pembroke Castle on a rainy November evening in 1456. His horse lathered in sweat from a long and weary journey across Wales. Margaret, who had been spending her time praying for Edmund's safety, sensed something was amiss before the messenger even spoke. The look on his face was enough. Her world was about to shatter once again. Edmund's death, like many deaths in the turbulent times of the Wars of the Roses, was shrouded in mystery. He had been campaigning in Wales against the forces of the rival Yorkists, when he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The details of his capture remain murky, some saying it was a surprise attack that left his forces scattered, others suggesting betrayal from within his own ranks. What was certain was that Edmund's capture marked a significant blow not just to the Tudor family, but to the fragile Lancastrian cause as a whole. He was a loyal servant to the House of Lancaster. His death left a gaping hole in the strategic plans of Margaret's family. The most perplexing aspect of Edmund's death was the claim that he had died of plague while imprisoned by his captors. While it was true that disease was common in medieval prisons, especially given the lack of sanitation and the prevalence of infections, there were those who doubted this explanation. The speed with which Edmund's health declined, and the refusal of his captors to allow any physicians to attend to him raised suspicions. Some believed that Edmund had been murdered in prison, a silent victim of political intrigue. Others suspected that his death had been hastened by the very forces who had captured him, a calculated move to weaken the Lancastrian cause even further. Regardless of the cause of death, Margaret's world was irrevocably altered. She was no longer a newlywed, married to the man who would secure her place in the political arena. Instead, she found herself a widow at the age of 13, carrying the weight of her unborn child while facing the deepening chaos of England's civil war. Edmund Tudor, the man who had been her political partner, the father of the child she carried, was now gone, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. But Margaret was no stranger to loss. She had already suffered the mysterious death of her father, John Bowett, when she was just a child. Now, she faced the possibility of losing everything again. The death of Edmund was a personal tragedy, but it was also a political disaster. With Edmund's death, Margaret's place in the Lancastrian cause became uncertain. She was now pregnant, widowed, and alone, left to navigate a treacherous world of shifting allegiances and power struggles. The news of Edmund's death reached Margaret in the quiet solitude of Lampfee Palace in Pembrokeshire, where she had been staying while he campaigned. Alone in the palace chapel, she had been praying for Edmund's safe return when the messenger arrived. The chill of that November evening, the darkened skies, and the sound of the messenger's boots echoing through the stone halls marked the beginning of a new chapter in Margaret's life, one defined not by a loving marriage, but by grief, uncertainty, and survival. Jasper Tuda, Edmund's younger brother, took it upon himself to care for his pregnant sister-in-law in the wake of the devastating news. Jasper, a man still in the early stages of his own military career, understood the importance of protecting Margaret, both for political reasons and because of the future she carried within her, the potential heir to the Tudor name. Jasper brought Margaret to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle, a fortress perched on the cliffs of Wales, where the turbulent political winds of England could not reach her. Pembroke, with its stone walls and remote location, would provide the physical protection Margaret needed. But emotional protection was another matter entirely. The journey to Pembroke Castle was an ordeal in itself. Winter had set in, and the roads were barely passable, rutted with frozen mud and blocked by fallen trees. Margaret, already burdened with the weight of her pregnancy, traveled in a horse-drawn litter, the constant bumps and jolts sending pain through her fragile body. The journey, which should have taken 2 days, stretched into 5, as they navigated around flooded rivers and avoided armed men whose loyalties remained uncertain. Every moment on that journey was a reminder of Margaret's vulnerable position in a world that was slipping further into chaos. Once she arrived at Pembroke Castle, the stark reality of her situation set in. The castle, though strong and ancient, was a harsh refuge. Its cold stone walls offered no warmth against the biting winds of winter. The chambers, though furnished with tapestries to block the wind, were drafty and uncomfortable. The fires in the hearth devoured wood faster than the servants could supply it, and Margaret found herself confined to her chambers, unable to walk the length of the room without feeling exhausted. Her body, still that of a child, was weighed down by the physical burden of her pregnancy. The castle's physician, Dr. Louis Carlion, a learned man who had studied at both Oxford and Paris, examined Margaret with growing concern. Her pregnancy was far from normal, and he feared for her life. Margaret's body was still developing, and her hips were too narrow for the baby growing inside her. The child was positioned wrong, and labor, Dr. Carlion feared, would likely result in death for both mother and child. He spoke in private with Jasper, advising that the birth would be dangerous, and suggesting they prepare for the worst. Despite the grim prognosis, Margaret's resolve remained firm. She understood the stakes her life, her child's life, and the future of the Lancastrian cause all hung in the balance. The war was not just a battle for the crown, it was a battle for survival, for the very existence of families like hers, whose fates were tied to the throne. Margaret, though only 13, was about to face a trial that no child should ever have to endure. And as she lay in her chambers, preparing herself for what was to come, she knew that whatever the outcome, she would be changed forever. In the cold isolation of Pembroke Castle, surrounded by the distant sound of crashing waves and the howling winds of a harsh Welsh winter, Margaret began to realize that the world she had once known was slipping away. With Edmund's death, her childhood was effectively over. No longer a young girl with dreams of a normal life, Margaret was thrust into the harsh reality of political survival. With the weight of her family's future resting on her shoulders, in her early days at Pembroke, Margaret was overwhelmed with grief and confusion. She had lost her father at a young age, and now, at just 13, she was a widow, carrying a child she had not chosen to bear. Her pregnancy, once a potential symbol of hope for the Lancastrian cause, seemed like yet another burden, one that threatened to break her body and spirit. The castle's cold stone walls offered no comfort, and the constant chill of winter seemed to seep into her very bones, mirroring the coldness she felt inside. But it was during this time of seclusion and personal turmoil that Margaret began to develop a sharp, strategic mind. She had been raised in a world where survival depended not on personal desires or romantic notions, but on political cunning and the ability to navigate an ever-shifting web of alliances and rivalries. With her husband dead and her family's future uncertain, Margaret knew she could not afford to dwell on personal grief. She had to learn quickly how to survive in a world where betrayal was commonplace and loyalty was often fleeting. Margaret's mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Beauchamp, had been a master of political survival. Though she had lost her husband and her daughter's betrothal, she had never allowed personal loss to cloud her judgment. She knew the importance of alliances and the power of manipulation in a world ruled by nobles who cared little for family, but everything for power. The Duchess had spent her life securing the futures of her children, and now, as Margaret faced her own uncertain future, she could not afford to let her mother's teachings fade into the past. During her time at Pembroke, Margaret was isolated from much of the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses, yet she was not entirely cut off from the world. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother, took responsibility for her care and safety, though his own position was fragile. Jasper was a loyal supporter of the Lancastrian cause. But with the increasing power of the Yorkists, his own survival was not guaranteed. He did what he could to protect Margaret, but with her due date approaching and political unrest growing, there was little anyone could do to shield her from the violence that seemed to consume everything around her. Despite the chaos and uncertainty that surrounded her, Margaret was determined to make the most of her circumstances. She threw herself into learning the intricacies of survival. She began to study the behavior of those around her, observing their actions and understanding the subtle signs of loyalty and deceit. Her education, once focused on the skills expected of a noblewoman such as music, embroidery, and household management, quickly turned to the harsh realities of political survival. Margaret understood that her survival depended on more than just her ability to endure. It depended on her ability to understand and outmaneuver those around her. She became keenly aware of the power dynamics within the castle, learning from the actions of the men and women who moved in and out of the walls of Pembroke. The servants, the soldiers, the courtiers all were players in the game, and Margaret learned to read their faces, understand their unspoken messages, and navigate their alliances. She spent hours with Father Meredith, the castle's priest, who had been educated at Cambridge. He taught her the art of diplomacy, explaining that prayer and action must go hand in hand. Father Meredith's teachings were grounded not just in theology, but in the practicalities of survival. He taught Margaret that while God's guidance was important, action carefully calculated, politically motivated action was the key to survival in this brutal world. He often spoke of how the divine worked through human agency. A prayer without effort was meaningless, but effort without faith was doomed. Margaret also took refuge in her faith during this tumultuous time. She found solace in the chapel of Pembroke Castle, where she spent hours kneeling before the altar, praying for guidance, for strength, for her family's future. Though she had already endured more than any child should, she began to find a sense of purpose in her devotion. It was as though her faith provided her with a quiet strength, one that allowed her to withstand the political storms that surrounded her. Yet even in her religious fervor, there was a growing awareness that faith alone could not save Hirsch. She needed knowledge, intelligence, and an unrelenting will to survive. Margaret's intense devotion to her religious studies became an outlet for her emotions, a way to cope with the fear and loneliness that gripped her. The hours spent in the castle chapel, memorizing Latin prayers and studying theological texts, allowed her to create a sense of control in a world that seemed utterly chaotic. But her faith also began to shape her political outlook. She understood that survival was not a passive act of waiting for divine intervention, but an active process of making calculated decisions, forming alliances, and securing one's future through both religious and political means. It was in this period of isolation, learning, and reflection that Margaret began to mature into the politically astute woman she would one day become. She understood the stakes of her survival, not just for her own sake, but for the future of her family, her bloodline, and the Lancastrian cause. She learned that to survive she would need more than just the strength to endure suffering. She would need the intellect to outmaneuver her enemies and the patience to wait for the right moment to act. The lessons Margaret learned in the cold, lonely halls of Pembroke Castle would serve her well in the years to come. She would no longer be the frightened child who had once wandered the gardens of Bleo Castle. She would become a force to be reckoned with, a woman whose intelligence, resolve, and political cunning would shape the fate of England itself. At just 13 years old, Margaret of Anjou gave birth to a baby boy. You might know him as the future Henry VII. But this is not her story. This is the story of Margaret. The year before, she'd arrived at Pembroke Castle in Wales with her husband, the Prince of Wales, and her father, the Duke of Somerset. But her father was soon killed in battle, and her husband died the following year. And now she was left to fend for herself, carrying his child to term. It was a difficult pregnancy. Her body, still that of a child itself, struggled to carry the weight of the baby. And when the labor began, it was clear that this would not be a simple birth. Dr. Louis Carlin, the castle physician, examined her multiple times throughout the pregnancy, each time growing more concerned. He had no faith that a normal birth would be possible, and when the baby was finally born, it was clear that he was right. The birth had left Margaret gravely injured. The doctors later confirmed what Margaret feared: she would never have children again. Her body, once full of life and vitality, was now irreparably damaged. The room, filled with the smoky haze of burning herbs and the steady flicker of candlelight, fell eerily quiet as Margaret lay, barely conscious, on her bed. The intense pain had dulled into an all-consuming numbness. Her frail young body had endured a journey no child should have been forced to experience. And yet, in that moment of excruciating exhaustion, something else, something miraculous emerged from the depths of her suffering. The first cry of Henry Tudor, her son, pierced the silence, small and fragile, yet undeniable in its presence. It was a sound that would change the course of English history forever. The baby, pale and covered in blood, lay for a brief, terrifying moment without breath. His tiny chest, not yet rising with life. A hush fell over the room, and the midwives who had spent countless hours assisting with births held their breath. This was a birth unlike any other. They had seen countless deliveries, some successful, others fatal, but this one felt different. Margaret's body had been pushed beyond its limits, and they feared that both mother and child had reached the edge of life itself. For what seemed an eternity, there was silence. And then, with a sharp intake of breath, the baby began to cry, weakly at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. It was a cry of life, of survival, and of promise. The room erupted in a mixture of relief, prayer, and gratitude as the midwives, shaking with exhaustion, rushed to clear the baby's throat and ensure his survival. The room was filled with the joyous sound of the infant's cries. But for Margaret, it was the sound of everything that had been sacrificed, of the years of political alliances, the battles fought on her behalf, and the future of her bloodline that now lay in the hands of this child. Through the fog of pain and weakness, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. Her head swam with exhaustion, but she managed to lift her gaze to where her son now lay in the hands of the midwives. For the first time in hours, the tightness in her chest loosened, and a small, fragile smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She had not died. The child had not died. Against all odds, they had both survived. Her son was placed on her chest, swaddled tightly in linen, his tiny form trembling slightly against her warmth. The bond between mother and child, though tenuous and fragile in that moment, was forged with the force of centuries of royal blood and the painful sacrifices that had paved the way for this child to come into the world. Margaret's arms, weakened from the trauma of birth, could barely hold him, but the moment he was laid against her chest, she knew that everything, every ounce of suffering, every moment of agony had been worth it. This child, born of pain, would one day wear the crown of England and reshape the future of the kingdom. The baby, now named Henry Tudor, was the son of Edmund Tudor, but his significance went far beyond his father's legacy. His birth marked the survival of the Lancastrian cause, the continuation of the family line, and a beacon of hope for those who still clung to the belief that the Red Rose of Lancaster could overcome the White Rose of York. In him lay the future of Margaret's family, the future of England itself. But this moment of triumph was bittersweet. Margaret's body, ravaged by the birth, could not escape the toll of her suffering. The aftermath of the delivery was brutal. The doctors and midwives examined her with grave concern. Her internal injuries were extensive, and they knew that she could never bear another child.
Ow.
The damage to her young body, inflicted by the violence of the birth, was permanent. At just 13 years old, she was effectively barren. The trauma of this birth, of bringing forth a child who would one day be king, had sealed her fate. Margaret would never again experience the joy or the burden of motherhood. Her child, born in agony, would be her only heir. As Margaret lay there, weakened and in pain, the weight of her situation began to settle in. The birth of Henry Tudor had not just secured her family's future, had shattered her own. Her role as a mother was irrevocably changed. She had given her body, her very self, for this moment, for the survival of her son. She would never be able to carry the hope of another child, and yet in Henry, she had found the one who would carry the legacy of the Lancastrians forward. For Margaret, the birth of Henry was both a blessing and a curse. She had brought life into the world, but she had also sacrificed so much of herself. In the years that followed, she would never again have the luxury of childhood, of dreams unburdened by the weight of political survival. She would no longer be a girl in the gardens of Bleo Castle. She was now a mother, a widow, and a political figure with a responsibility that would shape the rest of her life. The death of her childhood, the death of her innocence, was sealed in that moment when she gave birth to the future King of England. Yet in that one brief moment, when she held her son against her chest, Margaret knew that despite the pain, despite the sacrifice, she had done what needed to be done. This child, her son, would one day be the king who ended the Wars of the Roses and founded a new dynasty. The cost of his birth was immeasurable, but it was a cost she was willing to bear, because in his survival, the future of England had been secured. Margaret lay in a haze of fever and exhaustion in the days following the birth of her son, Henry Tudor, the pain of childbirth. The trauma to her young body was not something that could be easily forgotten or ignored. As the midwives and doctors hovered over her, tending to her injuries and trying to manage the severe blood loss, Margaret's body, still that of a child, was pushed beyond its limits. The birth had not just been physically draining, it had irreparably harmed her, leaving scars that would never heal. Her internal injuries were extensive, and Dr. Louis Carleon, the castle physician, made no effort to soften the truth. He spoke of torn flesh, of broken organs, and of a body that had been forced to give more than it could bear. Margaret's pelvis, still too narrow to handle the weight of a child, had been stretched beyond its capacity, and as a result, the damage was severe. There was little hope for recovery, and Dr. Carleon made it clear that her ability to bear children in the future was forever compromised. At 13, Margaret's body had been irreversibly altered. She would never experience the joy or pain of motherhood again. Her future as a mother, once full of potential, was now forever altered. The trauma of the birth had sealed her fate. Margaret's body, in service of the Lancastrian cause, had been sacrificed in a way that no child should ever endure. The knowledge that she would never carry another child was a bitter pill to swallow, and for Margaret, it was a deep emotional wound that compounded the physical agony she was already enduring. The physical recovery was slow and agonizing. For weeks, Margaret hovered between life and death, her body struggling to heal. Her skin, pale and cold, seemed to absorb the chill of the Welsh winter, and the fever that gripped her body made her delirious at times. The pain of her injuries was constant, an unyielding reminder of the price she had paid for the survival of her son. Her days were spent in a state of half-consciousness, drifting in and out of feverish sleep, while the midwives and Dr. Carleon worked tirelessly to bring her back to health. In the long hours of her recovery, Margaret found herself caught between two worlds, one where she was a young girl still growing and learning, and the other where she was a woman marked by the brutality of childbirth, a woman who had sacrificed her body for a political cause. There were moments when she resented the fact that her body had been used in such a way, moments when she longed for a life free from the weight of duty. But those moments were fleeting, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. Even as her body struggled to heal, Margaret's mind was sharp. She understood that her role in the political landscape was far from over. Her son Henry Tudor would one day be king, and as his mother, she would have a significant role to play in securing his future. The years of struggle, suffering, and loss had made her stronger, and though her body was broken, her spirit remained unyielding. Her emotional recovery was even more complex. The trauma of the birth, coupled with the emotional toll of losing her own ability to bear children, left her with deep psychological scars. There were times when Margaret found herself staring blankly at the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, her thoughts drifting into dark places. The guilt of not being able to provide her son with siblings, the grief of knowing that her own body had been used up for the sake of politics, these emotions weighed heavily on her. Margaret, though, was not one to surrender to despair. Even in her weakest moments, she found strength in the purpose that her son's survival gave her. She knew that Henry's future was tied to her own survival. Without her, there was no Lancastrian cause, no hope for the future of her bloodline. And though the trauma of childbirth had scarred her physically and emotionally, it also awakened something in her, a deep, unrelenting drive to secure her son's future at all costs. As Margaret recovered, she became more determined to navigate the treacherous political landscape that lay ahead. She was not just the mother of a future King Shay, was a player in the Game of Thrones, one who would need to use every tool at her disposal to ensure her son's survival. She had already survived more than most people ever would, and now, in the quiet recovery of Pembroke Castle, she began to understand the power of her position. She had borne a king, and her blood, though damaged by the physical toll of childbirth, was still royal. Her recovery was long, but it was not without purpose. Margaret spent hours studying the political situation, learning from those around her and observing the way power shifted in England. She understood that the Wars of the Roses were far from over, and that her family's future would depend on her ability to navigate the complex web of alliances and betrayals that marked the English court. Through the pain, through the isolation, and through the grief, Margaret found her voice. She had been broken, but she was not defeated. The suffering of her body, though immense, had not diminished her will. Instead, it had forged a new sense of resolve. Margaret was not just a mother. She was a strategist, a survivor, and a woman who would do whatever it took to ensure that her son, Henry Tudor, would one day wear the crown of England. Margaret's physical recovery was slow, but it was her emotional and intellectual evolution during this time that would ultimately shape her legacy. As the months passed in the cold and isolation of Pembroke Castle, Margaret's body healed, but the scars left by the traumatic birth of Henry Tudor and the subsequent limitations of her fertility became permanent markers of the immense sacrifice she had made for her family's future. Yet even as her body was broken, her mind grew sharper, her resolve harder, and her sense of purpose clearer. The birth of her son, though costly, had given Margaret a sense of identity and power that would resonate throughout her life. The early months of recovery, while filled with pain and vulnerability, also provided Margaret with an opportunity for introspection. The isolation of the castle, nestled against the fierce winds of the Atlantic coast, gave her time to reflect on the events that had shaped her life. In the solitude of her chambers, surrounded by the cold stone walls of Pembroke, she began to understand the true weight of her position. She was not merely a grieving widow or a mother recovering from the trauma of childbirth. She was a woman of royal blood. With the future of her family resting upon her shoulders, Margaret threw herself into study, guided by both necessity and ambition. Her reading and religious devotion became her refuge. The endless hours spent in the castle chapel were more than just a means of solace. They were a strategic use of her time. Her faith, though intense, became an integral part of her political toolkit. She pored over theological texts, memorizing prayers and deepening her understanding of Christian doctrine, which in the medieval world was both a personal comfort and a political necessity. In an age where the church wielded immense influence, Margaret knew that her religious devotion could both protect her and enhance her political standing. Father Meredith, the priest at Pembroke Castle, took on the role of Margaret's spiritual mentor during this time. Though his primary concern was her spiritual well-being, he recognized that Margaret's political intelligence was rapidly growing. He often spoke of the role of divine intervention in human affairs, but he also stressed the importance of action. It was a balance that Margaret would later come to embody. Prayer without action was futile, but action without prayer could lead to ruin. Margaret absorbed these lessons with intensity, understanding that her family's survival depended on her ability to move through the world with both the grace of a devout woman and the cunning of a political strategist. Margaret's religious devotion was not born out of mere piety. It became a form of resistance. It was a way to regain control over a world that had taken so much from her. By dedicating herself to faith, Margaret carved out a space where she could find some semblance of power in an otherwise powerless position. The faith she developed during this period was not the blind submission of a young girl, but the calculated piety of a woman who knew that in a kingdom ruled by divine right, one could wield religion as both shield and sword. As she recovered, Margaret's political acumen grew. she began to observe the shifting allegiances within the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions. Reading the signs of the court and listening to those who came to Pembroke Castle with news of the world beyond, she understood that her survival depended not just on her son's future, but on her ability to align herself with powerful allies. The Lancastrian cause, already on the verge of collapse, would need more than just the birth of a king to survive. It would need a woman of skill, determination, and intelligence to guide it through the years of warfare and political intrigue that lay ahead. In the isolation of Pembroke, Margaret's connection to the outside world grew ever more vital. She began to send letters to the few allies she had left, communicating with key figures within the Lancastrian faction. These letters, often cryptic and written in careful code, were her lifeline to the world beyond the castle. Through them, she kept herself informed of the ongoing conflict, the shifting tides of support, and the movements of key players in the Wars of the Roses. Margaret was learning how to navigate this tumultuous world with the patience of a strategist, calculating each move carefully and making sure her position remained strong, even when she had little direct influence over events. But it wasn't just the political maneuvering that consumed her thoughts. Margaret's religious devotion deepened during these months, and the relationship she built with God during her recovery became the foundation of her strength. The castle's chapel, with its stark, simple beauty, became her sanctuary, a place where she could go to pray, to reflect, and to find solace in the midst of the violence and uncertainty of the world around her. The faith that had once been a quiet part of her life grew into an unshakable pillar of support, one that would guide her through the darkest days of her life. Her intense spirituality was not just a means of comfort, but a way to gain control over a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. Margaret was not just a pawn in the political chess game of her time, she was a player. A woman who understood that survival required not just cunning, but also the strength of faith. And it was this faith, combined with her growing political savvy, that would carry her through the trials to come. As Margaret's recovery continued, her understanding of power grew. She was no longer just a passive participant in the game of politics. She was a key figure, a woman with both the intelligence and the drive to ensure her son's place on the throne. She had already sacrificed her body and her youth to ensure his survival, and now she would use every tool at her disposal to secure his future. Her deepening faith, her sharp political mind, and her resilience in the face of unimaginable loss would make her one of the most powerful and influential women in English history. The storm of civil war raged on outside the stone walls of Pembroke Castle. But inside, Margaret's understanding of the political landscape was evolving rapidly. The Wars of the Roses, the bitter and bloody conflict between the Yorkists and Lancastrians, had been simmering for years. But in 1455, the violence escalated into full-scale war. The First Battle of St. Albans marked the beginning of the end for the once powerful Lancaster family. Margaret, now a widow and mother to Henry Tudor, was caught in the whirlwind of a conflict that threatened not only her life, but the very future of her son. The Lancastrian cause was already faltering by the time Margaret became a widow. King Henry VI, whom Margaret's family supported, was weak and mentally unstable, unable to lead the country effectively. His reign was marked by factionalism, infighting, and an inability to secure the loyalty of the nobility. Meanwhile, Richard, Duke of York, seized the opportunity to challenge Henry's rule, claiming the throne through his descent from Edward III's second son. The Yorkists, led by the Duke of York, had the support of much of the English nobility, while the Lancastrians were weakened by internal divisions and a failing king. Margaret, though still physically recovering from her harrowing childbirth and the loss of her husband, was not blind to the dangers that loomed for her son. She understood that the survival of the Lancastrian cause depended not on the weak king, but on the actions of those who were loyal to the House of Lancaster. As her son Henry Tudor grew, so did the sense of responsibility Margaret carried. His future, the future of the Lancastrian line, was inextricably tied to the outcomes of the war. He was the only viable claimant to the throne who could restore the Lancastrians to power. But the path to the crown would be fraught with unimaginable obstacles. In the wake of Edmund Tudor's death, Margaret's role within the Lancastrian cause shifted. She was no longer just a grieving widow or a mother tending to her newborn son. She was a woman who understood that, in the violent world of English politics, Survival often depended on making difficult decisions and forging alliances that would ensure one's continued existence. The Yorkists, with their claim to the throne, were growing stronger, and Margaret, his own position as a member of the Lancastrian faction, made her both a target and a crucial ally. For those still loyal to the Red Rose, as the War of the Roses intensified, Margaret's political education continued. The news of battles and shifting alliances reached her in Pembroke Castle, and she knew that her son's survival was linked to the outcome of these conflicts. The Yorkists had control of the throne, and it was clear that the Lancastrians were on the losing side, yet Margaret refused to surrender to despair. She began to recognize that the only way forward for her son and for the Lancastrian cause was through cunning, resilience, and most importantly, patience. Margaret's ability to survive in such a tumultuous period was a testament to her growing political savvy. Even as the Lancastrian cause seemed to be unraveling, she remained resolute. She corresponded with key figures in the Lancastrian faction, gathering information, rallying support, and ensuring that her son's future remained a possibility, no matter how bleak the present seemed. She understood that the world of noble politics was not one of straightforward battles, but one of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. Survival required more than just foresight, required intellect and strategy. The fall of the Lancastrians became inevitable in 1461 when the Yorkists decisively won the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest conflicts in the War of the Roses. King Henry VI was captured and imprisoned. Then Edward IV was crowned king. The Yorkists had seized control, and the Lancastrian cause seemed doomed to extinction. For Margaret, this was a moment of profound crisis. Her son, still a child, had no direct claim to the throne, and the once great power of the Lancastrian family was reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. Yet Margaret's survival instincts kicked in, and she quickly realized that the end of the Lancastrian reign was not the end of her family's story. Her son, Henry Tudor, though in exile, represented the last hope for the restoration of the Lancastrians. Margaret, though isolated in Wales, began to think strategically. The Yorkists had gained control of the throne, but their reign was fragile. The legitimacy of their rule was constantly under question. Edward IV's victory, while seemingly decisive, did not end the War of the Roses. It merely shifted the balance of power. For Margaret, the fall of the Lancastrians was not the end. It was a temporary setback, a pause in a much longer struggle for the crown. The years following the Yorkist victory were marked by political instability. Edward IV's rule was plagued by internal dissent and the growing resentment of many of his nobles. The Lancastrian supporters, while scattered and disorganized, remained loyal to the cause, and Margaret continued to nurture these alliances. She understood that the survival of her son and his claim to the throne depended not just on military force, but on the willingness of key factions to support him. Margaret spent these years gathering resources, making secret alliances, preparing for the day when her son would return to England and claim what was rightfully his. The fall of the Lancastrians had not destroyed Margaret's hope, had only fueled her determination. She would not allow her son to be forgotten or ignored. Henry Tudor's time would come, and Margaret would be the one to make sure that he was ready. As she watched the Yorkists consolidate their power, she knew that their rule was not as secure as it seemed. The political instability that had plagued England for decades was far from over. Margaret's patience and strategy would one day pay off. In the years that followed, as the conflict between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians raged on, Margaret would prove herself to be one of the most politically astute and resilient women in English history. The fall of the Lancastrians, though devastating, was not the end of her story. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one that would ultimately see her son, Henry Tudor, rise to power and reclaim the throne of England as Henry VII. And when that day came, it would be Margaret's cunning, perseverance, and loyalty that had ensured her son's success. After the crushing defeat of the Lancastrians and the rise of the Yorkists, Margaret was left in an uncertain and perilous position. Her son Henry Tudor was still in exile, and the political landscape had dramatically shifted in favor of the Yorkist forces. With King Henry VI imprisoned and Edward IV seated on the throne, Margaret found herself not only without her husband, but also without the support of the royal family she had once been a part of. As always, Margaret found a way to survive, even in the face of these overwhelming challenges. In 1458, only months after the death of her first husband, Edmund Tudor, Margaret remarried. This time, her choice of husband was not for personal affection or love, but for political necessity. Henry Stafford, the younger son of the Duke of Buckingham, was her new partner, and their marriage represented an important shift in Margaret's strategy. Stafford's marriage to Margaret was pragmatic. He was a Yorkist sympathizer, but unlike many of his peers, he was also a man of exceptional political calculation and loyalty to his own family. Stafford had the military influence and connections Margaret needed to safeguard her son's future. The marriage was, from Margaret's perspective, more a business arrangement than a romantic union. She knew that her son's future depended not just on her ability to survive, but on the alliances she could forge with powerful men like Henry Stafford. Stafford, in turn, understood the advantages of marrying Margaret, although she was a widow and her son was in exile. She carried with her a bloodline connected to the Lancastrian cause, which still held significant sway among those who opposed the Yorkists. As for Stafford, the marriage provided him with both a valuable alliance and the promise of the support of the remaining Lancastrian factions. Despite the political nature of their union, the marriage to Stafford marked a significant turning point in Margaret's life. Stafford was a man who understood the importance of alliances, and while he was a Yorkist sympathizer, his pragmatism would eventually work in Margaret's favor. He provided her with the stability and support she needed to ensure her son's claim to the throne was not forgotten. Stafford was able to secure military protection and the political cover that Margaret would require, even as her son remained in exile. Margaret, ever the strategist, realized that her marriage to Stafford would give her the tools she needed to continue the fight for her son's future. But the union came with its own complexities. Stafford, though pragmatic, was loyal to the Yorkist cause, and this created tension within Margaret's heart. The marriage was politically advantageous. It also meant that she was bound to a man whose loyalties lay with the very faction that had taken her son's birthright. Still, Margaret understood the necessity of this union. For her, survival was paramount, and her personal feelings were secondary to the broader goal of securing her son's future. She was no longer a naive child. Her experiences with betrayal and loss had hardened her, making her realize that love and loyalty were luxuries that did not always serve her needs. In the years following their marriage, Margaret and Stafford worked in tandem to protect her estates and ensure her son's claim was not forgotten. Stafford provided military protection, and together they navigated the dangerous waters of the political world. Margaret, ever astute, built alliances with key figures in the Lancastrian faction, making sure that her son's supporters remained loyal, even as the Yorkists seemed to gain an unshakable grip on power. She used her marriage to Stafford to shield her and Henry's interests, while also continuing to lay the groundwork for Henry's eventual return to England. During these years, Margaret continued to display a political acumen that few could match. She built a network of support, making alliances with men and women of influence in England. Even as she remained largely absent from the English court, Margaret's intelligence and foresight allowed her to navigate the tumultuous years that followed. As the Lancastrians were driven into exile and the Yorkists cemented their power, despite the seeming dominance of the Yorkists, Margaret knew that power in England was never static. The Yorkists, while seemingly secure, had their own internal struggles. Their hold on the throne was far from unassailable. The marriage to Stafford was not without its challenges, but it gave Margaret the stability and resources to continue her mission. The political landscape of England was still in flux, and Margaret understood that she needed to position herself carefully for the moment, when the tide would turn in favor of the Lancastrians once again. As she spent the next years strengthening her alliances and protecting her family's interests, Margaret became ever more determined to reclaim her son's birthright. Though her relationship with Stafford was primarily political, it was effective in securing her place in the world. Stafford, though initially a Yorkist sympathizer, was slowly drawn into Margaret's orbit as she skillfully planted seeds of doubt about the Yorkist cause. She did not challenge him outright, rather, she fed his growing disillusionment with Edward IV's reign, highlighting the flaws and instability within the Yorkist leadership. Margaret knew that Stafford's loyalty could be swayed, and in time, her political maneuvering would bear fruit. The marriage to Henry Stafford, while not born of love, became an essential tool in Margaret's arsenal. It was not just a political alliance, it was the first step in securing the future of her son and her family. Through Stafford, Margaret was able to build the foundation of the support network that would one day bring her son back to England. As the years wore on, she never lost sight of her ultimate goal, to place Henry Tudor on the throne of England. And though the path to that goal was fraught with difficulty, betrayal and heartbreak, Margaret's unwavering resolve would prove to be her greatest asset. The turbulent years following the Yorkist victory in the Wars of the Roses saw the rise and fall of many figures, each trying to carve their place in a fractured England. Edward IV's reign, though momentarily secured after his victory at the Battle of Totan in 1461, was anything but stable. His rule faced constant challenges, both from within his own ranks and from the powerful Lancastrian supporters, who still longed for a restoration of their house. Among them was Margaret, still determined, still vigilant, and most importantly, still holding on to the dream that one day her son, Henry Tudor, would return to reclaim his rightful place. The years of exile were not easy for Henry, as the son of Edmund Tudor and Margaret. Henry's claim to the throne was a complex one, but it was the only viable alternative to the ruling Yorkists. The constant threat of death from the Yorkist forces loomed over him, and yet, through the guidance of his mother, Henry survived. He was raised in Brittany, away from the dangers of England, but not free from them. The Duchy of Brittany, though technically independent, found itself caught between the competing pressures of England and France. Henry's exile there kept him alive, but also made him a pawn in the greater struggle for control of England. Margaret, now fully aware of the political game she had to play, worked tirelessly to keep her son's cause alive. She knew that his survival depended not just on her actions, but on carefully nurtured alliances across Europe. She corresponded in secret with various figures in England, from those loyal to the Lancastrian cause to those quietly disillusioned with the Yorkists. Her sharp political mind recognized that her son's path to the throne was not just a matter of military might. It was a matter of carefully orchestrated diplomacy and timing. But it was not just Margaret's intelligence that sustained her cause. It was her understanding of human nature. She knew how to read the court's undercurrents, how to exploit the cracks in the Yorkist armor. She also knew that the rise of the Yorkist dynasty, though triumphant, was far from assured. Edward IV, though king, was not universally beloved. His reign was plagued by questions of legitimacy, internal dissent, and the instability of his rule. The question of succession, still uncertain, created the perfect opportunity for Margaret to act when the time was right. In 1469, after years of uncertainty, events began to move in Margaret's favor. Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, once a staunch Yorkist supporter, turned against Edward IV. Warwick, disillusioned with Edward's rule and the failure of his own political machinations, shifted his loyalties and began to secretly work with Margaret. The Kingmaker, as Warwick was known, had the resources and influence to stage a rebellion. Margaret's alliances with key figures in England became crucial during this time. She knew that the rebellion against Edward IV was not just an opportunity for her, it was a potential lifeline for her son's future. In 1470, Warwick's rebellion successfully restored Henry VI to the throne, albeit temporarily. Edward IV was forced into exile, and for a brief moment, the Lancastrians seemed to be on the verge of reclaiming the throne. Margaret watched closely as her long-held dream appeared to materialize. Henry VI, though a weak and ineffective king, was crowned again. But the reign of Henry VI was short-lived. In 1471, Edward IV returned from exile, defeating Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, and shortly thereafter at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The Lancastrian forces were crushed, and Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London. The Yorkists were back in power, stronger than ever, but the defeat of the Lancastrians, though devastating, did not mark the end of Margaret's efforts. Her son, Henry Tudor, was still alive, still in exile, and still a threat to the Yorkist crown. Margaret, with her deep understanding of the political currents that ran beneath the surface of English court life, knew that the Yorkist victory was precarious. The death of Henry VI and the defeat of Warwick did not eliminate the problems of succession. Edward IV's own rule was not universally accepted, and Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, still had a legitimate claim to the throne, albeit distant. By 1471, with her son in exile and the Lancastrian cause seemingly dead, Margaret had a critical decision to make: stay passive and wait for another chance, or act decisively. Margaret chose the latter. She understood that power was in constant flux, and that even in the face of adversity, opportunity could still present itself. The death of Henry VI, though tragic for the Lancastrians, did not end the struggle, it merely shifted the focus. Margaret knew that, eventually, the time for Henry Tudor's return would come, and she would be ready. As Margaret continued her secret negotiations and built a network of support, the world around her grew ever more unstable. The Wars of the Roses were not over, and the future of England remained uncertain. But Margaret's quiet resolve and strategic vision, coupled with her son's claim, would soon prove to be the seeds of a new era. In the midst of the turmoil, Margaret's persistence never wavered. Her son's exile, though painful, was part of a longer game, one in which patience and calculated action would ultimately secure the Tudor dynasty. The return of Henry Tudor to England would mark the beginning of the end. For the Wars of the Roses and Margaret's efforts, though often unseen, would prove to be the bedrock on which the future of England was built. The years of exile had forged Henry Tudor into a resilient and strategic leader, biding his time while Margaret worked tirelessly behind the scenes, maintaining the dream of a restored Lancastrian monarchy. The Wars of the Roses, though devastating, had created the perfect environment for Henry's eventual return. As the Yorkists consolidated their power, their rule was far from secure. Edward IV's death, and the subsequent usurpation of the throne by Richard III, had left the kingdom in turmoil. Richard's reign was marked by suspicion, and his claim to the throne was never truly solidified in the eyes of many. This instability provided the perfect opening for Henry Tudor's return, and Margaret knew it was time. The years of patient political maneuvering and careful alliances came to a head in the summer of 1485. Margaret's son, now a man in his 20s, finally gathered enough support to mount an invasion of England. Henry had spent years in exile, but the growing discontent with Richard III, combined with Margaret's persistent behind-the-scenes work, allowed him to rally key figures to his side. Margaret, through her connections, had played a pivotal role in ensuring that Henry's supporters remained loyal, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The stage was set for a decisive moment in English history. The Battle of Bosworth Field, fought on August 22, 1485, would prove to be the final confrontation between the forces of the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. Richard III, despite his military experience, faced a challenge he could not overcome. Margaret, though not physically present on the battlefield, had been instrumental in arranging the key alliances that ensured Henry's forces were strong and resolute. The most significant of these alliances was her own connection to Thomas Stanley, who commanded significant forces in the north of England. His loyalties were crucial to Henry's success. Stanley's forces were instrumental in tipping the scales at Bosworth. The battle itself was a bloody and chaotic affair, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Richard III, facing the combined forces of Henry Tudor and his allies, fought with determination. But the conflict was ultimately decided not just by military strength, but by political calculation. As the battle raged on, Thomas Stanley and his forces, who had initially remained neutral, made the decisive move. Stanley's troops turned on Richard, effectively sealing his fate. Richard, surrounded and overwhelmed, was killed on the battlefield, his body stripped and left for display. His death marked the end of the Yorkist rule and the rise of Henry Tudor as the new King of England. The victory at Bosworth was not just a military triumph, it was the culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, and perseverance. Henry Tudor's victory was not solely his own. It was Margaret's as much as it was his. Her tireless work behind the scenes, her careful cultivation of alliances, and her unyielding faith in her son's cause had brought him to this moment. With Richard III dead and the Yorkists defeated, Henry Tudor ascended to the throne as Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret, once a child caught in the politics of royal marriages, now found herself the mother of a king. Her son's victory was a testament to her strength and vision. But the triumph was bittersweet. Margaret had sacrificed so much over the years: her health, her childhood, her ability to have more children. and even her personal happiness. Yet in that moment, as Henry VII was crowned king, Margaret knew that her sacrifices had not been in vain. She had given everything for this moment, and now her son would carry the crown that had been long denied to their family. Henry VII's first act as king was to marry Elizabeth of York, thus uniting the warring factions and ending the decades of bloodshed. The marriage symbolized the end of the Wars of the Roses and the beginning of a new era, the Tudor era. Margaret, though not the focus of this public union, had once again secured her family's future. Her son's reign would bring stability to England, and the tumultuous years of civil war would give way to a period of relative peace and prosperity. But for Margaret, the triumph at Bosworth was not the end of her journey. Her role as the mother of the king would continue to shape her life and her legacy. As Henry VII consolidated his power, Margaret took on the role of a matriarch within the new court, advising her son when necessary and ensuring the stability of the Tudor dynasty. Her influence, though often behind the scenes, was felt throughout her son's reign. She had survived the unimaginable losing her first husband, the death of Henry VI, the exile of her son, and the constant political machinations of the Yorkists, so only to emerge as the mother of a king. The victory at Bosworth and Henry VII's subsequent reign marked a new chapter in English history. The Tudor dynasty, founded through the blood, sweat, tears of Margaret's perseverance, would dominate England for over a century. Margaret's legacy would endure through her son and through his descendants, who would go on to shape the fate of England, most notably her grandson, Henry VIII. But in the quiet of her later years, as she looked back on her long and tumultuous journey, Margaret knew that the true cost of her triumph had been far greater than anyone would ever truly understand. She had sacrificed her own childhood, her health, her personal happiness for the sake of her family and the future of the Lancastrian cause. Her suffering had been immense, but in the end, it had all led to the birth of a dynasty that would change the course of history. After the Battle of Bosworth and the coronation of her son, Henry VII, Margaret found herself in a new, yet familiar role. Though the crown now rested on Henry's head, the political landscape was far from secure. England, having spent decades embroiled in the Wars of the Roses, needed not just a king, but a strong foundation to sustain the monarchy for generations to come. Margaret, as the mother of the new king, would play an integral part in the early years of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret's influence was never overt. She never held a formal title or wielded power through the traditional means of nobility. Yet her position as mother to Henry VII gave her a form of power that few could challenge. As Henry consolidated his rule, Margaret worked behind the scenes, using her wisdom, connections, and political acumen to ensure the survival of her son's reign. The Tudor dynasty, though born from the blood of her enemies, needed stability, and Margaret was key in providing that foundation. As Henry's reign began, Margaret's role as a mother and advisor became crucial. Henry, though capable, was still a young king. The political landscape was filled with the remnants of the old rivalries and resentments. Margaret's keen understanding of the court, gained through years of observation and her own survival, allowed her to help guide Henry through the complex political waters of his early reign. She understood the importance of maintaining alliances, both within the English court and abroad. The marriage of Henry VII to Elizabeth of York, while politically necessary to unite the warring factions, was just the beginning of the work that needed to be done to secure the throne. Margaret's power was not only based on her relationship with her son, but also on the connections she had built over the years. She had formed alliances with powerful figures in England and beyond. As a widow, and later as the mother of the king, Margaret became a formidable figure in her own right, a woman whose wisdom and experience made her indispensable to Henry. Though she never sought public glory, she quietly worked behind the scenes, ensuring her son's authority was respected and his reign strengthened. One of Margaret's greatest strengths as a matriarch was her ability to navigate the changing tides of power. The political landscape in England was volatile, and Margaret knew that her son's reign could be undone if the wrong alliances were made, or if the wrong moves were taken. Through careful diplomacy, she ensured that the Yorkist threats were quelled. The Lancastrian hold on the throne became more secure. Margaret never underestimated the fragility of power. Her actions reflected a deep understanding of the necessity of caution, patience, and timing. As the years passed and the Tudor dynasty grew, Margaret's position in the royal court became more solidified. She was not just the mother of the king, but a key advisor and a symbol of the strength of the new monarchy. The Tudor family, once on the brink of extinction, now stood as the dominant power in England. Margaret's sacrifices, her political insight, and her role as a mother had brought the family to this point, and her influence would help to ensure its future. However, despite her success, Margaret's own personal happiness was often sacrificed for the sake of her family and her son's future. She had endured unimaginable hardship, losing her first husband, the pain of childbirth at such a young age, the trauma of exile, and the years spent in political struggle. Yet, through it all, she remained unwavering in her commitment to the survival of the Tudor dynasty. Her personal losses, though immense, had shaped her into a woman of incredible strength, resolve, and political savvy. Margaret's legacy was not one of personal glory or fame, but of quiet determination and maternal sacrifice. She had given everything for her son, for the future of the Tudors, and for the restoration of the Lancastrian cause. Her role in history, though often overlooked, was crucial to the survival of the Tudor dynasty and the eventual rise of one of England's most powerful monarchs, Henry VIII. The world would remember Henry for his many wives and his role in the English Reformation. But it was his mother, Margaret, who had ensured that he even had the chance to rule. Without her sacrifices, her alliances, and her political maneuvering, the Tudor dynasty would not have survived the Wars of the Roses. As Margaret grew older, her influence began to wane, but her legacy lived on through her son and his descendants. She died in 1509, just days after Henry VII's coronation. A fitting end for a woman who had devoted her life to securing the Tudor throne. Margaret's death marked the end of an era, but it also signaled the beginning of another, the reign of her son, Henry VIII. And the establishment of the Tudor dynasty is one of the most influential families in English history. Margaret's life, though filled with hardship, was a testament to the power of maternal sacrifice, political acumen, and the will to survive. She had been a mother, a wife, a widow, and a queenmaker, and through it all, she had secured a legacy that would change the course of history. In the annals of English history, Margaret of Beaufort stands as one of the most important figures. A woman whose quiet strength and unyielding determination helped shape the future of England for generations to come. In her final years, Margaret of Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, had seen the fruits of her labor unfold before her eyes. The Tudor dynasty, which she had fought so tirelessly to establish, was secure. Henry VII had solidified his reign after his victory at Bosworth, and now, as king, he had married Elizabeth of York, uniting the two warring houses. Together, they had laid the foundation for a new era in England, a period marked by stability, which would lead to the rise of one of the most famous monarchs in English history, Henry VIII. But while Margaret had achieved the unimaginable, restoring the power of the Tudors and securing her son's reign, her own life had been one of sacrifice and relentless perseverance. Her personal happiness had always taken a back seat to her devotion to the survival of her family and the greater cause of the Lancastrians. Throughout her life, Margaret had been driven by the singular goal of seeing her son crowned king. And once that was accomplished, she could finally take a moment to reflect on the legacy she had built. Margaret's last years were marked by a sense of quiet triumph, though tinged with sadness and the weight of the struggles she had endured. As the matriarch of the Tudor family, she had outlived most of her contemporaries, including her first husband, Edmund Tudor, and even her son's early reign. In her later years, she watched as her son, now king, began to shift the power of the monarchy in new directions. Henry VII was a cautious and pragmatic ruler, but his son, Henry VIII, would go on to reshape England in ways that Margaret could never have anticipated. Though Margaret was not as directly involved in the court's politics during her later years, her influence was still felt. Henry VII, though often distant and reserved, had a deep respect for his mother. Margaret had shaped his approach to rule, teaching him the importance of patience, alliances, strategic political maneuvering. Her survival through years of exile, warfare, and personal suffering had made her a woman of extraordinary wisdom, and her guidance was invaluable to her son, even if she was not a visible presence in the royal court. Margaret's final years were spent largely in the quietude of her estates, far from the bustling court of Henry VII. As a mother, she was proud of her son's accomplishments. But as a woman who had borne the heavy burden of their rise to power, she knew the cost of their success. The weight of her own sacrifices, the loss of her childhood, her health, and her personal happiness was something she carried with her throughout her life. Yet in her son's success, she found a quiet peace. The Tudor dynasty she had fought for was now firmly established, and the future of England was secured under her son's rule. Margaret's role in history is often overshadowed by the actions of her son, Henry VIII, and his larger-than-life reign. But Margaret's influence was pivotal in ensuring that the Tudor family not only survived the brutal conflict of the Wars of the Roses, but thrived. Her political acumen, her sacrifices, and her relentless drive to see her son on the throne laid the groundwork for the powerful Tudor dynasty that would dominate England for the next century. The end of Margaret's life was peaceful, and she passed away on June 29, 1509. Just days after the coronation of her son's successor, Henry VIII. It is a poignant irony that she, the woman who had fought so hard for her son's crown, did not live to see him fully reign over England in the way history would remember him. However, she had accomplished her ultimate goal. The Tudor dynasty was firmly established, and Henry VIII was on the throne. Margaret of Beaufort's legacy, though quiet and often unseen, was profound. She had been the architect of the Tudor rise to power, and without her dedication, her strategic alliances, and her unwavering faith in her son's destiny, the Tudor family would not have reached the heights they did. She was the mother of a king, a woman who had seen more than her fair share of suffering, but had never wavered in her determination to see her family succeed. In the centuries that followed, the legacy of the Tudors would be defined by the actions of Henry VIII and his children. But it was Margaret of Beaufort who, through sheer will and sacrifice, made their reign possible. Her story, though often overlooked, is one of quiet strength, political brilliance, and maternal love qualities that have ensured her place in the annals of English history. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey, where she was laid to rest alongside her son, Henry VII, and her grandson, Henry VIII, stands as a testament to the pivotal role she played in shaping the Tudor dynasty. The inscription on her tomb reads as a simple yet powerful reminder of her legacy: Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Her name may not have been as widely recognized in her time as those of her more famous descendants, but history remembers her as the quiet architect of one of the most transformative periods in English history. As the winds still howled across the cliffs of Pembroke, and the legacy of the Tudors continued to unfold, Margaret's influence lived on not just in the bloodline she left behind, but in the enduring strength of the dynasty she had made possible.